All right, so here we go. Chapter 10, Democracy in America. In this chapter, we're going to explore the very concept of the term democracy. I know we all may be aware of what that means and that we're giving power back to the people, or that it should be the governance of the people and by the people. You know, when you look at other ocracies, if you will, so like an oligarchy, that's the rule of a few. Then you have the aristocracy, that's the rule of the rich. You have a monarchy, which is the rule of one. You have anarchy, which is the supposed rule of none. And then we have democracy, which is the rule of the people. And in the United States, there's a tendency to confuse the word democracy with our situation, when in reality, there's a hybrid of sorts, but we're more a republic than anything. I've always stressed you can go and look in the Declaration of Independence and you'll never see the word democracy. You can look in the U.S. Constitution and you'll never see the words democracy. You'll see the idea of this nation was to found a republic, as championed by Thomas Paine, where you had representatives chosen by the people, and then those representatives would make decisions on behalf of the people. So we don't have like a direct democracy. We have a democratic republic of sorts, in which we do have elected officials by the people, who then make a republic type of environment, and then those individuals make decisions. The idea of democracy is appealing to the people. It makes them feel that they are involved and they have a chance. So if you are an individual who wants to make the people feel positive about governance, democracy would be a good way to go about doing it. You can see here on this slide that it says by 1860, all but one state had ended property requirements in order to vote. So, you know, at the cusp of an American Civil War, all but one state were willing to accept the notion that the greatest sense of ownership should be the ownership not of property but of self. And this was reflective of that generation or that era's sense of individualism, as founded by way of the Transcendentalist movement, the Market Revolution, and the Second Great Awakening. There was a greater sense of self-understanding and self-ownership, that those concepts were very definitive of early America. And we felt that that was way more important, the ability to own oneself, than the ownership of property, especially when it came to expressing yourself by way of voting. Now, during this time period, and when I say this time period, let's just go ahead and put it out there to be about 1830 to about 1860. So it's running parallel with the Market Revolution. It's running parallel with Manifest Destiny, Transcendentalism, and so forth. Now, during this period, newspapers are very prominent. White newspapers, black newspapers, Native American newspapers. But the idea of reading in general was growing, and that meant that there was a greater sense of readership. Now, when you pick up a newspaper, or when we used to pick up newspapers, there were various categories you would browse through and consume. You know, there would be a business section, there would be a politics section, a cartoon section, there would be an entertainment section, and so forth, and then local and national news. And you could pick and choose what you wanted to delve into, and then if you were curious, because it was there, you might browse another section to see what it had. But because you were having a wider audience, there we had to appeal to that audience in order to sell the product. So newspapers began emphasizing sensationalized news. The newspapers and the media began sensationalizing crime stories and exposés of official misconduct. And what we ultimately can discern from that is apparently in this information revolution, people enjoyed sensationalized issues. You could have people today that make arguments that the media has sensationalized the coronavirus, or that the media has sensationalized black on black crime, or that the media is sensationalizing the primaries. We can always make these critiques. We could always say that the media heightens sensibilities with crime stories and docudramas like the Tiger King, and we're always interested when public officials, who we give them this higher level of esteem, seem to not be able to carry the weight of that crown or mantle, and it falls on them. So we have exposés of official misconduct. We can make an argument for the impeachment of a president. But by and large, what I'm getting at is uh, what people were interested and consumed by back then are just like the people who are interested and consumed by things today. We're no better creature or less selfish or involved creatures today than we were back then. We're all, I mean, by and large, we're all trash to some degree. Now, one thing I do want to focus on, and I want to stress this before into where we start underlining things, this also happens to be a period in which more and more Americans are reading than ever before. During this information revolution, we'll have more and more Americans that are literate than many other nations that have been around for centuries. So we pride ourselves on an educated electorate, because we believe that if we are giving power to the people must have the power of knowledge first and foremost. Um, Now, getting back to the things that we must underline, I want you to underline the Freedom's Journal, and you need to understand that this is America's first black newspaper. The question we have to ask ourselves when underlining a term like this is, well, why do we need to have a black newspaper? Why don't they just read the normal newspaper? All right, so first off, pause. When you are listening to individuals, we're not trying to play a game of I got you. We're trying to understand what people say, why they say it, and in what context are they saying it. Everything comes in context of prior sentences, prior phrases, and what ultimately will come after the fact. In this particular case, I said, why don't they just read the normal newspaper? Okay, so what we're implying there is that the paper that currently exists, which probably is appealing to a white audience, is considered normal. If I have to consider that normal, then these other papers that represent marginalized sectors of our society, they must be abnormal. Um, and that's what some people, in a very sleight of hand, a very nimble use of rhetoric, are stressing that uh, there are things that are normal, which is the white male perspective, because that's what you would get from a newspaper around the 1830s. There weren't many black journalists who were able to write for a white newspaper. There weren't many women journalists that were able to write for a white newspaper. So you were constantly getting things from the perspective of white males in America. And that's fine, especially if you're appealing to that audience. But then the voices of marginalized sectors of our society, they never get represented, or if they do get represented, it's usually in a stereotypical or characterized manner. So, in an effort to kind of provide a different avenue for understanding the world around them, black people created their own newspapers, and the Freedom's Journal happened to be the first black newspaper in the United States. It had a readership. It didn't last long because the bottom line is this: how many black people are reading during the 1830s and 1860s? The percentage of free blacks in America at the time was maybe around 9 or 10%. And if you're reading that newspaper and you're only operating with 10% of the economy to support it, it could be difficult. But nonetheless, they do it. Now, you could make an argument that, or this was what's interesting on top of all of this, is you have white America who could make a racial, uh, uh, well, they could racialize issues, and they could ultimately say, well, the reason why we don't talk about black issues is because who's going to read it? Why should we even care? And look, the bottom line is there isn't black art, there isn't black culture, there isn't black politics, there isn't black entertainment. You know, they can make an argument that there's not a lot of these things, when in reality there are. It's just that nobody's paying attention to it. And then secondly, nobody's giving them a platform to present that information. So that's why they had to start their own, because they weren't allowed to exist in the so-called normal newspapers. So the Freedom's Journal will exist, and that's just a demonstration that black people were able to read, they were able to write, they were able to be creative, they did have stories to tell. And that's important because it implies that all the stereotypes and racist attitudes that were developing about people of color back then were simply just not true. They were false. And the Freedom's Journal is evidence of that falsehood. Now, I want you to underline the Cherokee Phoenix, and this will be the first Native American newspaper. And again, they will address Native American issues because they were not being addressed in the so-called mainstream newspapers. And it too will be significant because it too will also address the needs of the Native American people, but also stand as evidence against the stereotype of Native Americans being backward savages, you know, any type of racial rhetoric that was existing and being or permeating throughout society during this period. Racism does exist, and in our society, we would understand racism to exist not only in the South, but definitely up north. We had an individual by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. He's a French journalist of sorts, and he comes to the United States. He writes a book called Democracy in America because he wants to understand what that concept means here, because France was about 10 or 20 years behind in their endeavors with democracy, or their play with democracy. He felt, well, let me come to America and see what it looks like, and that would be it would almost be like traveling to the future. In doing so, what he finds out is that people are more racist. There's more vitriol and hate towards people of color up north than there is down south. Oddly, the reason for that is because the institution of slavery would put black people in their place. Now, in the north, that institution doesn't exist. So you have to have an attitude that exists, and this will be a racial attitude all throughout America known as Jim Crow. So go ahead and underline Jim Crow. Please understand that this is a racial attitude that exists in America and reinforces many of the stereotypes that people place upon black Americans, even if they are enslaved or if they were free. And we could see that there was discrimination against blacks even up north, despite the fact that many northern states were slowly eliminating slavery, or some had completely eliminated slavery from for it being legal in states. Others were slowly going in that direction, but it was apparent that you could be a newly arriving immigrant from Europe and you would have more rights, more opportunities afforded to you simply because you were white, you were European, you look like the people who this country was founded upon, founded by. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean I'm saying that this country was built by white Americans or people from Europe. You can look at this cartoon right here, and this is from Life magazine, and you can see the exaggerated nature of an African American, and you got to understand why they would exaggerate an African American in the first place. When you looked into theater, blackface, Jim Crow theater was, you could argue, America's first form of popular entertainment. And what I mean by that is many people were going to minstrel shows in general. Minstrel shows implied that you would hear a song, a dance, and it would be performed by, theater actors. But most people entering theater as a way of occupation were probably not newly freed slaves, African Americans, or slaves themselves. There probably wasn't a single black person growing up like, mother, father, I wish to pursue theater, or I wish to pursue an instrument or music. That was not a reality for many African Americans. So you had a lot of well-to-do white Americans who never had those type of barriers placed in front of them, and so yeah, they're going to pursue those type of endeavors. But when lacking black characters, they said to themselves, well, I got to make a black character. So we took a white person and we said, you're now going to act black. Now, if that white person sees themselves as the opposite of black, because white is the opposite of black, they might also take into consideration that, well, my features are this, and I'm the opposite of white. So the opposite of white features will have to be this. And so they begin to exaggerate the features when they would do blackface. And the white man would say, well, I'm honest and I'm smart and I'm calculated and I have manners and I'm white. Now, if I'm black and black is the opposite of all those things, then I must now act and engage in those type of behaviors, which would be unbecoming of any human individual. So what they do with blackface is they dehumanize uh, and and uh, and engage in caricatures of humanity, whether they're white or black, in this exaggerated tone. And you got to know that it's not going to be the best notion of that individual. So when we talk about blackface and you hear about it and you hear people say blackface is messed up, and you're like, well, what about whiteface and what about brownface and what about any other type of face? Look, the reality is the following. Anytime you are criticizing an individual, making fun of an individual in jest, look, we have the ability to influence people by way of our jokes. And people can say, well, not all jokes are funny. No, they're not all funny, but that doesn't mean you can't try to make something funny. Because then how do you know if something is funny if you're not allowed to try, if we begin policing the way we communicate in that capacity? There's a tendency to give theater and comedy like this license to creative in that sense, but the bottom line is if people are bothered by it, they're going to be bothered by it. Now, the difference with blackface is that there is a history, a long history associated with this type of character, resulting in these type of attitudes, and then those attitudes turning into various types of action. There is a history of that. Now, in other cultures, there might, I'm sorry, not other cultures, and for other minority groups, and we could even argue, well, there's whiteface, why don't they, look, these attitudes will exist for sure. I think what some people would argue is that if you have a history of violence associated with the attitude, then there would be a reason to see a parallel. But it's obvious that one of these attitudes was more vicious and vile over the years, and that is blackface. So just as a precaution, as I always tell my students every single year, but because for some strange reason people just don't get it, and I understand that, and it's because people don't understand the generations that came before, which is why young people today would uh, have no clue who the Beatles are or who Led Zeppelin is, and understandably so. Every generation is going to enjoy their generation's music, and you'll have some old souls here and there. But bottom line is, over time, people are going to be like, the Beatles, who's that? Or why am I listening to that? In the same way that I would look at music from the 30s or the 40s and like big band music, I'm not listening to that nonsense. Or old jazz, I'm not listening to that because it's just not of my desires and whatnot. So I mean, we get it, but the bottom line is that people are forgetting history, and we're forgetting where this stuff originated from and why.